Welcome to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us. Welcome, everybody, to Et Al, a podcast of Baylor University Press. I'm Anna Kate, your host, and today I am joined with two of our authors. We have with us Joshua Cockayne. He is a lecturer of mission and evangelism at the Cranmer Hall in Durham, and he's the director of the Bede Center for Church Planting Theology. We are also joined with Gideon Salter, who is the research associate at the Department of Psychology at the University of York. So welcome, you guys. We're so glad to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Gideon and Joshua have written a work together called Why We Gather, and we're here today to discuss this book. And so I wonder if you guys could open us up just with a brief description of the book and your contributions to it and how you hope that this book will be received.
Yeah, the book is an attempt for us to think about what it is that we do as Christians when we come together. Most Christian traditions will gather in some shape or form, singing hymns, hearing sermons. Lots of Christian traditions do it differently. But our hope is to try and make sense of what it is that we do when we gather. I think it's probably helpful to say a bit about where we're coming from. I'm a theologian. Most of my work has been on the nature of the church, thinking about worship and liturgy and prayer. And Gideon is a psychologist who I affectionately like to say Gideon just studies babies. He spends all his time watching babies. But I think that, and it's actually the dialogue and the friendship between us that's kind of at the heart of the book, is trying to use those different areas of expertise to understand what it is we do when we gather together as the church.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think sort of from that friendship, there's been this sort of extended conversation going back, I think it's like 2018 now, isn't it? Or 2019. I think that kind of highlights that despite these quite potentially different disciplines, there's these sort of points of contact where we both were just interested in very similar things around shared experience, gathering, how we connect with other people through those kind of experiences. So despite perhaps different sort of traditions and methodologies, really there were these sort of common interests and common questions that we wanted to explore, and a sort of common agreement that the tools of both psychology, or sort of my specific corner of psychology, and Josh's specific aspect of theology and sort of tools from philosophy as well, were sort of valuable at providing insights into those questions. So, that's sort of the approach we took, rather than sort of maybe a larger sort of science and religion conversation. It was two particular people with a set of shared interests and a knowledge base that just happened to connect really well on these specific questions.
Sure. And I think that really shines through in the book. Even just the layout, the way you guys kind of have the chapters, the way there are tables and charts representing the studies you guys have done. And so I think that is really helpful to know kind of that it's grown from a friendship into this study and into wanting to answer some of these questions. So what inspired the study that was conducted and explored in this book? And then what were you looking for or hypothesizing, and how did the findings either reflect that or move in another direction?
Yeah, I don't think we really started with a hypothesis of what we'd find. I think, as
Okay.
Gideon said, we started with a shared interest, and actually the shared interest that we have is to understand joint experiences, if you like. There are lots of experiences that we have of the world which we jointly attend to, and a lot of Gideon's psychological work tries to make sense of how that helps us to develop from the kind of really earliest stages of our existence. But actually, it applies much more widely. We attend to the world with other people. It's kind of like a building block of how our world is created, is that we attend with other people. It's really, rather than coming with a hypothesis, we came with a shared interest in that concept of how the world is shared. But actually, that shared interest has allowed us to ask lots of different questions. And asking those questions, I think we've been given some kind of new perspectives to think about worship and to think about the life of the church. And so actually, I think the research has gone in some quite unexpected directions. For instance, we didn't set out to write a book together. we thought we might have something interesting to say about prayer, so we wrote a research article together. And then we found some other topics that we might be interested in. And before we knew it, we were like, actually, we've got enough material here to do something longer, and that would be kind of interesting to explore. So in a way, we kind of wrote a book by accident, right? We didn't we didn't have a kind of we didn't deliberately set out to investigate something and have a hypothesis. We kind of emerged through the shared interest and shared conversations.
Yeah, I think even the empirical work that I do, for example, as Josh alluded to, is kind of like primarily focused on babies and young children. So it's more that it's sort of provided a set of like conceptual resources to help explore these issues. And it may well be that, down the line, it would be nice to think about ideas for potential like empirical studies that address some of the themes that are in the book. But ultimately, that wasn't really the primary goal. It was maybe perhaps more to sort of map out the sort of conceptual landscape and have some sort of constructive, sort of conceptual and theoretical proposals that draw upon aspects of theology and psychology, and a range of different sort of findings that are there. So, while my specialization is developmental, we draw upon other sorts of themes from social psychology, and work from cognitive anthropology on ritual, for example. So yeah, it sort of synthesizes those different sorts of ideas and themes.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. And I liked the language that you used, Josh. You said that you kind of had these questions surrounding how we share the world. That's really intriguing to me. And I think it is a big part of what you guys are after here with Christian gathering, worship gathering. And so you both have alluded to the fact that something that came out of this is not necessarily what you were expecting. So I wonder if you could share some of those insights. What were some of the maybe one or two things that you weren't expecting that came out of the writing of this book?
Yeah, one of my favorite bits of the book is the material on what psychologists call social loafing, which is not a concept I was familiar with before I started these conversations. So social loafing is particularly used in kind of business organizational psychology, when they're talking about how we create the most efficient teams possible. So if you're creating a business, what you don't want is for people to kind of freeload on the energy of others. You want everybody to be able to contribute maximally to what we're doing. And so there's this whole kind of it's kind of strange to me as a theologian, but maybe it's normal to some people. There's this kind of strange literature of business psychology, which is all about how do we avoid social loafing within organizations and make sure everyone can contribute. And we found that a really intriguing way to think about actually within the church, theologically. I mean, St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians that actually the church is defined not by its strongest parts, but by its weakest parts. In 1 Corinthians 12, Paul says that if one member of the body suffers, that we all suffer. And so actually there's a sense in which social loafing, if that's what you want to call it, is what we should expect in the church. It's not something we should try and avoid, but it's actually just I think that concept helps us to make sense of the fact that we want the church to be able to carry those that are weakest, so that on the energy of those that are able to participate. And so for me, that was a really fascinating insight and something that I would never have been able to kind of explore without this kind of interdisciplinary conversation. But it really kind of fleshed out to me what it looks like to carry the burdens of the weakest. Maybe it means letting them contribute less, or sometimes contributing hardly anything at all.
Yeah, that's actually the first one that came to mind for me, and this sort of intriguing idea that there can be these, sharedness and a sense of jointness or a sense of oneness doesn't imply complete sameness, that there can be these sort of asymmetries in participation, asymmetries in experience within the shared experience. Another part of the chapter I found particularly rewarded to work on was, I think it's the 6th chapter, where we think about children's participation in worship and how, this question of, does it matter that there's a baby there, right? Like they're not singing and they're not moving in the same way as other participants in say a worship service. Does it matter that they're there, and in what sense are they sharing in that jointness or that joint experience? And we even consider sort of some more sort of practical outworkings of that. So where are the children? Where are the infants during the service? Are they fully there, present? Are they, taken outside to a different room or different space? Are they sort of somewhere in between? And not to sort of come up with necessarily like this is the best way to do things, but rather again sort of just provide a really sort of clear set of concepts and a framework for thinking through those sorts of issues. I think that was sort of a rewarding thing to work through, and just sort of as well as a sort of theoretically just interesting question of who is participating, what does it mean to participate. We give the example of children and infants, but that can apply to various sorts of marginalized communities, or people with intellectual disabilities, for example, or physical disabilities. What does it mean to include them? Intuitively, we want to say it's really valuable to have them as part of our community. So how are we ensuring that they are sharing in these experiences? How are we making sure that the way we talk about these experiences isn't implicitly or explicitly excluding them?
Yeah. And you both talked on that sense of inclusivity in the gathering, right? That, for instance, what Joshua brought up was the idea, this loafing, or that not everybody has to contribute the same amount, and that in fact, Paul calls us to bear up those that are weaker. And then what you're saying, Gideon, as well, that even the children, the infants, those that, people see as distractions many times or as unable to participate, but maybe exploring some of those ways that they are included and they are able to participate in the worship, and how that affects the others that are involved. And so, what is the nature of gathered worship in the Western world? So I wonder if you would maybe define that term, gathered worship, and then explain to us what it kind of looks like in today's world.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth saying that we wrote some of this book was written whilst I think the church was in a bit of an identity crisis with this question, because
Yeah.
in between 2020 and like 2023, depending on whereabouts in the world you lived, the church was unable to gather in buildings to worship.
Mm,
And if it did gather in buildings, it was kind of weird. I don't know how it was in the States, but I found going to church with a mask standing like 5 meters away from someone really bizarre.
right. Yeah.
I think that's everybody's been forced to ask that question in some way. What does it mean for the church to gather? And in a certain sense, we don't want to give a really straightforward answer to that question in the book, because actually one
Mm,
of the things we want to show is that what it means for a community to gather is complex and it's multi-layered. So we want to avoid the kind of cheap answer which I think the church often gave in the pandemic, which is gathering in person is always good and gathering online is always bad. Or sometimes
sure.
some churches gave the opposite answer to that, didn't they? Right. Um, so I think we want to offer some kind of complexity to that question, and some of
Mm,
that comes from some of the psychological work which we do in the book, which is that when we think about the way in which communities join together, there are lots of different layers to that. A good example might be in the UK, if the World Cup is on, the Football World Cup or the Soccer World Cup, to you guys, there's a sense in which you can kind of guess that most of the country has some kind of cultural knowledge of what's happening. It's a bit
right.
like maybe like the Super Bowl would be a good example, right, in the States.
Sure.
So there's a sense of sharedness, there's a sense of community that comes, even though we're all in different spaces. I might be watching it on my TV in my front room. Gideon might be out in the pub watching the football. But actually, if I messaged him and said, "Did you see that amazing goal?" There's a sense in which that experience is shared. It's not just two individuals happening to watch the football. We're a community. We're part of something bigger. And actually, that's a kind of tease into the way we think about the church in the book, which is clearly the most obvious form of gathering is when we get in the same building, we're singing the same songs, listening to the same sermons, but actually there are different layers to community and different layers to gathering, which we were forced to explore in the pandemic, but have been there all along. I mean, I think it's important to see in Christian theology, the church doesn't just exist in a kind of this slice of where we are in history and in geography. Um,
Hmm.
we say in the creed that we believe in the one holy Catholic and apostolic church. This is the church. The church exists throughout time and throughout the world. And so actually our gathering is nested within this much broader sense of community. I think that's kind of how we approach the question in the book is we want to show that community is a really complex idea, but it's really important to think about its role in the church.
Yeah, I think And to build on that, I think there are tendencies, and we discussed some of these tendencies in traditions in the West. Like, I guess explain the fact that just even to gather in the same building or to be in the same building does not necessarily lead to a particularly sort of rich joint experience. You can have styles which end up being quite individualized. I think sometimes, if you're still in that context and you think, does it matter that I'm here physically present with these people around me? Would I be having any different an experience if I was just by myself? And sort of to question, well, why is that the case? Is there a sort of lack of aspects of the service that are connecting me with the people around me, or sort of reminding me that this is I'm part of a community that's exists on multiple layers, both the people who are gathered here and the church body as a whole, for example, and just the different ways you can express jointness and sharedness. These different ways can all be described as joint, but they can look quite different. And can express different kind of values. So, for example, in the chapter where we explore prayer, we look at a range of different examples. So, for example, there's a approach called Korean prayer, where a lot of people pray their own prayers simultaneously. So there is a sense in which it's joint. Even though you're doing it by yourself, you're doing it aloud and alongside other people. But that's a very different kind of joint prayer experience to another case where people are sat on opposite sides of a room, and then one half of the room will say one part of the prayer or liturgy, then the other half of the room will sort of reply. You've got this sort of tennis match of prayer going on. And they're both kind of shared, they're both going to be described as joint, but we need sort of kind of careful ways to describe what makes them both, described as joint in some sense, but also clearly distinct and different. So I think, that's what we're trying to do is sort of tease about, okay, well, what tools can we gain from psychological research that help us think about, well, how do we create a sense of sharedness? What does that look like in the context of a social interaction, and then how is that sort of transposed into the context of worship or liturgy? So things like synchronous movement, or sort of more like contingent, conversational response and reply type speech, or where your gaze is directed, or where you're physically positioned within the space, the shape of the space, what aspects of the space are particularly highlighted and therefore a strong cue that we're all attending. When the priest raises, in the context of the Eucharist, raises the wafer and draws the whole community's attention to that. These are all different ways that we're expressing jointness, that we're joining together the attention of people in that space, even though they look quite distinct and diverse, and there are different aspects that facilitate that.
Yeah. Both of you brought up kind of this idea of liturgy, and so you led me right into my next question, so thank you for that. Joshua, you brought up the creed, which I think is really important, and the idea of the universal or Catholic Church, right? And then Gideon, you pointed to different types of liturgy, either within one congregation. You mentioned even like gazing our eyes up toward the bread or the cup, or the you called it a tennis, like, right, call and response type of liturgical prayer. And it is, I think, significant that there are churches that do that within their own congregations, but also that with something like the Creed or certain liturgical prayers or books, that I could be reciting the same prayer in the United States that you might be reciting in the UK. And I think there is something really significant about that does really unite us. And so how do you think that liturgy is impacted by a group setting, and what is the benefit of being with a group in the practice of liturgy?
Yeah, I think you're right that there is actually the use of, particularly in historic denominations, that broader sense of sharedness can sometimes be easier to find. It doesn't mean it's not
Right.
there in other traditions, but I think if you
Right.
have a shared liturgy, or if you use the Revised Common Lectionary, which lots of the historic traditions of the church use, then there is something about the fact that, I'm reading Psalm 119 the same time as everyone else that is participating in that. And I actually think that does foster that kind of broader sense of sharedness. So I think actually liturgy can be a really effective way of creating and encouraging us to see the sharedness across traditions. It can also be used divisively, right? It can also be used to kind of exclude traditions that don't follow the same liturgy. So I don't think it's always as straightforward as saying if we've got liturgy, we've got this kind of built-in sense of sharedness.
Sure.
But so yeah, I think there are ways in which that it lends itself to that, but it's not always straightforward.
Yeah, I think I guess the key sort of theme or key concept we talk about is that of joint attention. This idea of your attention to a feature of the world is experienced as joint with another person or another community of people. And I think once we use that lens to try and understand liturgy, it can sort of help us make sense of that. So it helps us delineate the boundaries of who's in and out, because we're saying, these are the people with whom we can jointly attend. And so, as Josh says, you can use that to be inclusive or communal. You can use that on multiple different sort of layers, whether that's an experience you're having with the people directly around you and the way that's building a connection with them. Or as we've talked about, people across the globe, and even a sort of historic sense of and participating in prayers that have been said by Christians over the centuries. And that sense of sharing attention can help us understand that, and therefore understand why, when you say you're not going to participate in that to join attention, it can be, it's kind of a meaningful thing to do that. So
yeah, and I think too, just the idea, like you said, of not only people in 2025 that are reading out the same lectionary, but also, like you kind of pointed to, people across all times that for centuries have been praying these prayers, or to what you said, Joshua, even if it's not necessarily the same liturgy or the same prayer book, it's the same God, right? And I think that's one of the really powerful things, is just gathering together. It almost points to the cloud of witnesses, but just that idea that we're all united under this one thing. And so you guys both kind of pointed to liturgical loafing a little bit earlier in the episode. So I wonder if we could unpack that a little bit. Do you feel that COVID contributed to the decline in shared liturgy? Do you think we've kind of seen an uptick since then? And if so, how? How do you see this as kind of ebbing and flowing during and since COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have hard data in front of me, but for my day job, I teach people training for Anglican ministry in the Church of England, and we, at least in the Church of England, saw a really sharp decline in attendance numbers during COVID. The Church of England is not back at where it was before COVID in terms of attendance. I would guess that's fairly common in particularly in kind of mainline denominations. I think diaspora churches and Pentecostal churches are growing in the UK much more. I don't have the data for the US, but I do. This is a kind of intuition rather than anything that I can prove with hard facts. But I do think there was a sense in which, in the pandemic, we were encouraged to think of worship in much more individualized forms. So actually, particularly if you're a church that has kind of high value on music and preaching, I think it became quite normal for us to sit on our sofa in our pajamas, to sing along to the songs, to listen to the sermon. And actually, I'm not all that surprised that not many people came back if that was the vision of worship they were given. That it was about, we can do the same kind of consumption of worship from our sofa as we could do in church. In fact, I know plenty of people anecdotally that would say, this is just much more convenient for me. I can pause the live stream of the service and go and make a cup of tea, whereas I can't do that when I'm in the building, and I don't have to put up with talking to Gideon after the service, who talks so long I can never get away from him. So it just fits me much better. It fits alongside my modern lifestyle. I feel like that's a story that I've heard so many times since COVID, and so I think it did, depending on how we approached it. It did foster that. In the pandemic, I was part of a more traditional church in Scotland, and one of the things our vicar used to say throughout the pandemic was, "We are a people in exile until we can gather again around the Lord's table." That was this kind of like the line he would kind of repeat again and again in the pandemic.
Yeah.
And so there was a sense in which he was really clear about the fact that we've lost something in not being able to gather. And so when we came back together, there was a sense of anticipation that we were doing something for the first time, that what we were doing online was still worth doing, but it wasn't what we were meant to be doing. And I actually, interestingly, that church grew after the pandemic, but it supports my intuition that I think if you lean into the kind of more individualized aspects of church, I don't think people have any good reason to come back.
Yeah. Well, and you used the word consumption. You said consumption of worship when you were kind of giving the idea of being on your pajamas on the sofa, consuming worship. And there's a worship leader I really enjoy that he did a Facebook Live during the pandemic, just a worship set, whatever. And it's an album now. You can listen to it on Apple Music or whatever. And I go back and listen to it all the time. I really enjoy it. But because it's a Facebook Live, there's kind of these spots where he's like talking or, in between songs. And at one point he says, he alludes to the fact that COVID has kind of taken away this opportunity of us to be together. And he talks about consumerism that worship has become. And he says, if the worship leader plays a song I like, God, I might hook you up with a praise. That's the kind of language he uses. And I think about that a lot because I think it is something that during COVID, it kind of exposed us for who we were and what we were doing in worship. That I think even when we were gathered, I think there are groups and people and just human tendency that want to be entertained, that want to sit and consume the worship, to enjoy, that one really talented worship leader. And so I think there is just kind of almost this, like, we ripped off the Band-Aid a little bit in COVID and like truly exposed what was going on under the surface. And I think you're right that it did kind of perpetuate some of those things. But my inclination, I also don't have any data or hard facts, is that some of that existed before, and that it's just human nature that we're constantly fighting against. And so I think it is really, really important work that you guys have done, kind of uncovering this, and really pointing to it and pointing to the fact that that's not what worship and gathering was for, and what the intention behind it was. And so I think that's really important.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think, as that example kind of illustrates, like the relationship between the time where the community gathers and the rest of the week is something that I think is really important to reflect on. And this idea that what you do when you gather kind of enacts some of the values that you're going to be expressing in the rest of the week. As you said, like a weekly gathering is the approach and the format. We've talked about inclusion and exclusion as something that is enacted through the liturgy and how you approach the liturgy. But yeah, also how the community relates to each other. The ways in which the gathering maps onto how the community relates to each other the rest of the week is interesting, because in some ways it's going to reveal something of your values. I don't know if it perfectly, the way that you engage in liturgy and worship perfectly predicts all aspects of communal life outside of the gathered worship, but I'm sure just as it expresses these values, it sort of enacts these values, and the values will come through in the worship. And perhaps, we hope that the book sort of provides people with the resources and the tools to sort of say, okay, what kind of values are we representing in the way that we worship? Are we actually representing a quite individualized view of Christian community? And perhaps that can be a way of a source of reflection, and say, okay, we wouldn't have realized this or noticed this otherwise, but actually, as we reflect on the way we engage in worship, it reveals some of our maybe individualistic tendencies or exclusionary tendencies, whatever it might be. Or it might also highlight the positives. These are the things, these are the strengths of the course. I guess as we said, it's a conceptual toolkit that we think is valuable across traditions, hopefully, and a source for constructive reflection.
Yeah, that's great. And that's really helpful. I think you're right that the way a church practices liturgy or comes together during that one day a week reflects their values throughout the rest of the week. And I think that's kind of the fruit of some of the most, I hesitate to use the word successful, but some of the most successful churches is that they're living out throughout the other 6 days the things that they focus on and hone in on and practice and acknowledge during that one day. And so I think that you're right, that it either highlights the really positive things that congregation is doing throughout the week, or it can uncover maybe some of the faults that we're we're kind of addressing. So that's really helpful. What are some practical suggestions you have for churches to continue to gather?
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's a few things that kind of directly relate to the things we talk about in the book. Um, One of them relates to this sense of different modes of participation, or the loafing stuff, right? Which is, I think, not expecting group everybody gathering means that everybody has to participate in the same way.
Mm,
I think that's a really helpful practical thing. So I'm ordained, so I often will lead worship either at college or in a local church. And I think sometimes the expectation is if you're not singing, then you're not joining in properly, or if you're I don't know, my kids, if they're in the service, will run around at the back, or they'll color something in, or and I think there's the idea that that isn't a proper way of participating. And I
mm,
think one of the things that I hope we can bring practically is to say, well, no, actually, that's just a different way of participating. And
yeah,
there are many different ways that we could participate. That could still be valuable, and maybe that's all that person can manage this week, and that's okay. It doesn't mean they're not participating. So there's that. And I think the second thing relates to what we've just been talking about, which is my hope is that actually in seeing that gathering is not just one thing, but it has these layers to it, that we start attending to some of the other spaces in which we create that sense of community. Um, One of the really helpful things, we talked about the negative effects of the pandemic. One of the really helpful things that I think came out of the pandemic, at least in the churches I was in, was that people that were part of the community but couldn't get to church, like people that were in hospitals or that were kind of
mm,
confined to their beds, somehow were suddenly a huge part of the community again, because
yeah,
they could join in sometimes for the first time in decades or years. And so actually I think finding ways, that doesn't mean everyone has to use Zoom to do church,
sure,
but
yeah,
finding ways to create that broader sense of community. We use an example from the book, which I think is from one of Gideon's churches that he was part um, of a kind of shared prayer, um, a prayer that is said at the same time of the day within a community.
mm,
And just this idea that I know that everybody in the church is at midday going to be saying this, joining in this church act of prayer, I think does something to foster that sense of jointness.
yeah,
Yeah, that's the second one, I think, is just being more attentive to how jointness happens in other places and other spaces within the church.
right,
I think definitely we've kind of touched on some of answered that question in some ways, but to pick up on one of them, it's around what what is the space and how people are located in that space. How is that joining our
mm,
attention in different ways? And I think we do really want to. I mean, we kind of said this, but really want to emphasize. There are going to be different traditions that are going to have different emphases and different um, values.
right,
And so the particular answer to that question is going to look different in a evangelical Baptist church versus a maybe more high church or Anglican church. Um, they will have slightly differing sets of values, but I think it's still valuable in each context to think, what does the layout of how we position where people are sat, do in terms of directing their attention? Uh,
mm,
I think sometimes implicitly churches already do this, right? Think of churches which place the Eucharistic table right at the front and center versus those that have the preacher's pulpit in a certain more prominent position. They're sort of conveying um, different sort of information about where we should be jointly attending at different parts of the service.
mm,
But I think again, it's just something to really reflect on. Think, well, what is how we've laid out this space, what we've made prominent, um, what aspects are highlighted at different points in the service. How are they creating moments where we're joining our attention and sharing experiences? Is that what we want to be doing at those particular moments, or is it perhaps not? And so, yeah, rather than necessarily providing a specific answer, it's sort of as I said, sort of sets of tools to really think through: are we creating these joint experiences in the way we wish to, and if not, why not? And how might we better sort of foster that in sort of quite sort of tangible, physical, spatial sort of ways?
yeah. I think you're right. And I think, kind of to marry what the two of you are saying, I think also then, if you do have online participants, do you address them in the service, that kind of thing. I think even things like that there are just like these little details that really help understand who's included and who's excluded, whether for the better or for the worse. But I do think those small details, the positioning, like you said, of the Eucharistic table versus the pulpit, I think all those things really are shaping the gathering, whether we realize it or not. And so, how do you think that churches can combat a sense of individualism without completely forsaking the personal nature of religion and spirituality? Just obviously there is a personal aspect of our relationship with Christ. But how do we balance that with, the corporate aspect that is worship?
Yeah, I think I mean, one of the answers I think is that the gathered worship is, I think, sometimes is given a load that it can't bear. So
Hmm.
I think sometimes in some churches I've seen there's this idea that when we gather together on a Sunday, that's the kind of height of our discipleship and faith.
Yeah.
And actually, that has to fulfill everything that we need as a community. Is this 1 2 hour slot on a Sunday has to be the time in which I encounter Jesus, have fellowship with my brothers and sisters in Christ, hear from the Word, and actually that should be enough to sustain me through the rest of the week. I might kind of have a bit of time to top it up now and again. And I just think that's a really flawed way of thinking about church.
Mm,
So I think partly that putting all the load for the church's corporate life onto one gathering is just not very realistic. And I think in turn that just ends up forcing Sunday gathering to be this individualistic thing where it's actually me and Jesus.
yeah.
And so actually, I wonder if some of the answer is creating different spaces. My sense is, let me just give you a quick example of this. I used to be before I went back into teaching, I used to be a minister in a church in the UK. We had a really good student ministry with university students, and I was asked by the student pastor to come and speak on. They were doing a series on the Creed, so I went to speak on the Holy Spirit, and I gave this kind of 45-minute long kind of seminar on the nature of the Holy Spirit, and we got through the scriptures together and talked about the Spirit. And one of the students came up to me afterwards and said, "Why is the preaching not like this on a Sunday?" It was like, that was so helpful. Why can't we just have that kind of sermon on a Sunday? And my response was, because on a Sunday, I'm not just preaching to you. I'm preaching to the mum who's not slept all night and has come to
Mm,
church because she wants to gather. I'm speaking to the woman who's just got off a night shift, a series of 3 night shifts, and has just about managed to get the energy to get out of bed and come. I'm talking
yeah.
to the guy with learning difficulties who probably understands 10% of what I'm saying, but is there because he's part of this community and it means something to him. And so public worship is not the space for you to get everything you need.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if the guy likes the answer the answer that I gave him. But my
Sure.
answer was like, actually, this when we gather as a community, it isn't about you.
Yeah.
And so if you need that, then find somewhere else to get that.
Mm,
And so maybe I think it's about churches knowing that there are other spaces where we can do that. But when we gather as God's people, it's got to be about God's people, not about what you
yeah.
need.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a long, rambly answer, but
No, I love it. That was great. That was really great.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we try to be careful not to set up some kind of like oppositional tension between individual experience and shared experience. I think,
Yeah.
if anything, we highlight that, for example, seemingly individual experiences can often be more shared or corporate than we think. That human psychology is fundamentally characterized by a sort of social dimension, and we're sort of permanently permeated by our sociality, and it influences all aspects of our cognition and behavior. But that's not to say that we want to diminish the role of private prayer, um,
Yeah.
private contemplation, or scripture reading. Our goal is to articulate what is important about joint experiences and gathered experiences. We never want to diminish these moments of solitude, moments of individual reflection,
Yeah.
and also just in keeping our focus very tightly on the gathering part, perhaps sort of broader themes around living in codependent community. That's something that, as I've said, is enacted when you gather, you're enacting the examples just described. You've got this diverse community of different life experiences, of different educational experiences, and so on. And so it's sort of microcosm of that. But there are a whole bunch of further questions about what it means to live in, a codependent community where, all parts of the body are supporting each other, and the different sort of skills and abilities and talents that are expressed throughout the Christian life beyond those gathered moments. So I think, we don't try and tackle all those things, because I think we try and keep they're such important issues that they're inevitably sort of right there alongside this kind of question gathering, that hopefully some of the issues that we explore will then, again, lead to opportunities to reflect on, okay, if this is what it means to gather and have a joint experience in which there's different forms of participation in this particular moment of gathering, maybe that is telling us something about what it looks like to ensure, within the community at large, these different forms of participation and different forms of contribution, even when the community isn't covered.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, too, what you guys pointed to a little bit earlier, that the way that you practice community throughout the week, right, is going to say something about your values once you get into the corporate space. I think similarly that the way that you individually practice your faith throughout the week reflects in the corporate space. And I think if you're encountering and meeting and speaking with and reading Jesus every day, then when you come into the corporate worship, you're not expecting that to be everything, but it is an opportunity to be with others. And I think that's really important. And so, thank you guys.
So I think, as Gideon's just kind of highlighted there, we don't think this is the final word on this conversation. So actually, my hope is that if you're reading the book, that it stimulates lots more thinking on this, and you can go away and write another book. Because I think actually what we want to do is start a conversation. That's really kind of what we've been trying to do throughout. And so don't take this as the final word on what it means to gather. I hope it stimulates lots of thoughts and interesting ideas. But actually it will be, I think, seen in that light, I think it could be really helpful for different contexts and different people thinking about these questions.
And I hope it sort of underscores the value of this sort of extended conversation between these particular aspects of psychology and particular aspects of theology, and how, starting from these points of common interest and these points of contact, that it can sort of enrich those discussions and those reflections when you sort of recognize the different sets of resources that are there. I think that applies. I found it really valuable as a psychologist to have this experience and this chance to think through these questions. And it's the same for Josh. It's sort of mutually enriching, I think, is the sort of experience. And we hope that comes through in the book, and we hope that prompts others who maybe, whether they're academically in a particular sort of silo or particular sort of niche, or somebody who's not academic professionally but has maybe more knowledge in one particular niche or one particular area, that it sort of highlights the value of thinking across these different disciplines, across these different methodologies, across these different sort of traditions. Because as I say, we found it really valuable.
Well, thank you guys so much for taking the time to be on the podcast today. We are so grateful for your contribution and for this book. For those of you who are listening, we hope that you will purchase this work at baylorpress.com. Why We Gather is available to order. So thank you guys again for joining us, and we look forward to this book and to its reception. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you for listening to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.